He's Michael Lombardi, host of the GM Shuffle podcast, host of Coach with future Hall of Famer Bill Belichick, and you could catch him every morning on VSiN on the VSiN Morning Show. Michael, thanks for taking the time. How are we doing today?
We're good. Thank you, George. Appreciate you having me.
Of course, anytime. Excited to talk football with you. I want to talk Patriots, and let's start there. And looking more big picture, so far from pre-draft through free agency to now where the team is at, how do you assess how Elliott Wolf has done as a de facto general manager and the head of the front office for the Pats?
Well, I mean, look, they signed a lot of guys that Elliott was a part of before in prior regimes. I think one of their best players, Christian Gonzalez, was there last year when Elliott was part of the personnel department. So I think the mix of old and new has worked out really well, specifically when you look at their team. I mean, the offensive line is struggling right now because of injuries and because of a lack of depth. But for the most part, the strength of the team is in the defense. And if you go through the defense, whether it's Kenyon White, who was drafted in the second round last year, Gonzalez in the first, some of the guys, Dietrich Wise goes back a long way. Unfortunately, Barmore got hurt. But I think, to me, a lot of those decisions were part of the past regimes, which Elliott was a tremendous part of and instrumental in helping. So I think really well. I think, to me, the team has strength. I think they've done a good job of knowing what their strengths are, which is they're going to have to play a certain way, run the football, play great defense, and try to keep the game close to the fourth quarter.
Yeah, one of the highest rushing rates in the NFL belongs to the Patriots. Gerard Mayo said he wanted to run the ball. They're doing that. And you mentioned it too. Even with the lack of depth in the offensive line due to injuries, jumbo tight end, they'll go out there, and no one stopped Ramondre Stevenson yet. Now to ask you to put the GM hat back on from your days around the league. The Chuks Okorafor situation was signed by Wolf, brought in as a swing tackle, didn't work out after 12 snaps at left tackle, and now he's away from the team. His future still uncertain. That's reflective of Chuks. Sounds like he's bailing on the team early on, but also, is it reflective of Gerard Mayo at all when you assess that whole situation?
Well, no, I think it's more reflective on the player. I mean, part of the National Football League is it breeds competition. I mean, the one thing you're not guaranteed in the NFL is you're not guaranteed. There's no promises made. You could be – look at poor Bryce Young, his first pick overall in the draft. The team gives up a ransom to get him, and after 2 games, his second season in the league, he's benched. So the one thing we know about the NFL, there are no guarantees. You just have to fight and go through adversity and overcome them. And obviously, he didn't want to do that. So this is on him, not on anybody else.
Yeah, I think it's a great point there. And we'll see how the offensive line holds up with him gone and Vidarian Lowe banged up. Through 2 games, we've seen the Patriots go one-on-one. As of the time of me talking to you on this podcast, Thursday Night Football has not kicked off yet. But when we look at how that offensive line is played and how this offense has performed, and everyone's making the big deal of Drake May with his skill set can go out there and get a higher ceiling for this unit. And everyone's making a big deal of the protection for Drake May too. How do you approach this? Do you think the offensive line has to be in line and has to be consistent for Drake May? Or are you thinking, I think Drake May can go out there and play because of his athleticism along with how good of an arm he has?
Well, I just look at the rookie quarterbacks in the league. Bro Nix has thrown 4 interceptions, no touchdown. How about Caleb Williams? I think if the Patriots had the first pick in the draft, they would have picked Caleb Williams over Drake May. So let's just start at that point. I mean, the Bears can't run the football. They average 2.97 yards per attempt. They're down 33-13 at halftime. Williams has the lowest quarterback rating against pressure since 2016 with 20 dropbacks. He can't handle. He's 3-12 versus the blitz for 15 yards, and he's been sacked 5 times. And this is the best player in the draft. So, this nonsense about, we'll put Drake May and everything's going to be even better. Look, the Patriots are going to struggle to throw the ball, whether Drake May's playing quarterback, whether Jacoby Brissett's playing quarterback, or whether they brought Peyton Manning back or Tom Brady back to play quarterback. They're struggling. They scored 1 touchdown last year to a wide receiver. That was Juju Smith-Schuster. They can't really throw the ball outside the numbers so far this year because their skill level and talent level there isn't what it needs to be. So, they should be happy. Patriot fans should be happy. They were in a game. They got a chance to win tonight if they can run the football. If they get behind, the game's over, right? They can't play catch-up because they can't pass protect and they don't have a good enough passing game. And what happens is when you play outside of your comfort zone, and comfort zone meaning the style of play you have to play, I think ultimately that shows your deficiencies. And we haven't really seen the Patriots' deficiencies. We have. At the end of the half last week when they tried to throw the ball and they threw 2 incomplete passes and give Seattle that field goal at the end of the game, at the end of the half, that they played outside their norm, and it cost them the game essentially.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they opened up that possession, a run with Jermichael Hasty, who's not even a top two back. And you mentioned the two incompletions, Seattle with time on the clock, drove down, and obviously that field goal was crucial. Sticking on that point, I love that you bring up, I don't care if it's Tom Brady, I don't care if it's Peyton Manning. When you are building a roster around a rookie quarterback or someone that you need that they need to develop, how important is the offensive line? It's very important, but is that number one? Is it number two behind receivers? How do you build out that roster to help out a developing quarterback to flourish?
Well, look, offensive lines are like pitching in baseball. If you don't have good pitching, you're not winning. If you don't have a good offensive line, you can't win. Look, as good as the Rams have been, they got all their offensive linemen hurt. They got blown out in Arizona. You need an offensive line. That's why all this notion you have to draft receivers early. I mean, the Saints with Rashid Shaheed, he's leading the league in touchdowns and catches. He was a free agent out of Weber State. It's hard to find a free agent out of Weber State to start left tackle for you. You got to have great offensive linemen. Detroit's reason they're such a good team is Penei Sewell is one of the best offensive linemen, probably going to go in the Hall of Fame at right tackle. And they have really good. Frank Ragnon's a really good player, so they're really good in the offensive line. They can control the game. You can't get control of a game if you can't block. And football is not that complicated. And so all these teams that want to play Madden, like the Bears spent, they draft Rome Odunze after signing DJ Moore and trading for Keenan Allen. They can't block anybody. They're going to get their quarterback killed, right? You look at that. Their quarterback can't stay healthy. And then you look at some of these other teams in the league that can't protect it or wondering why. And I think a lot of it is because they don't put a priority on it. It's not sexy to draft an offensive lineman. Although Jim Harbaugh, what he made the point when he took the Charger job, if you don't have a good line, it breaks everything down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at how the Chargers built that offensive line. Rashawn Slater at Northwestern, Joel out of Notre Dame. And to your point, when they took Rome Odunze, Troy Fautanu was on the board, and he's been fantastic for the Steelers. And even they can go with other offensive linemen later on in that round. I love that you point out the success of the offensive line. Let's get back to how we've seen from the Patriots. They stunned the Bengals in week one, played disciplined football, ran the heck out of the ball. Then in week two, we see them make those small errors that were so costly. The blocked field goal they allowed off the left wing, the sack also in bad times by Jacoby Brissett. But when you see this Patriots game, through the two games we've watched, again, Thursday Night Football hasn't kicked off yet, is this team, how do they differ in coaching from when Bill Belichick was here to now with Gerard Mayo leading the helm?
I think it's too small of a sample size. I mean, Belichick won 6 Super Bowls, so I think it's really kind of unfair to Mayo to compare. I think, to me, Gerard's going to learn on the job. I think that's just naturally. He's never really coordinated defense before. This is his first time being in front of it. He's got to learn about his team. So, I mean, last year, the thing that was really disheartening about the Patriot games last year was the turnovers by the offense, which was horrible. They never played within their own element. They couldn't run the football. The offensive line didn't play better, and the fact they couldn't make a kick. I mean, Chad Runland, they couldn't make a kick, and this year, I think that's the other issue. They've got to get better in the kicking game, but their margin for error, George, is so small. They're not talented enough to just go out there and think they're going to play and beat somebody. They have to play a certain way, and they have to do it and execute with precise execution. They can't make mistakes. If they falter in any way possible and they get behind, if they're behind 10-0 tonight in the first quarter, they're going to have a hard time playing catch up. They're going to have to be disciplined and stay with the run game, because if they make this a 40-pass game, they will lose by 3 touchdowns.
Yeah, certainly. We see how they've won or were in the games the first 2 weeks. A lot of Ramondre Stevenson against the Bengals, and him and Antonio Gibson both combined going over 120 yards total on the ground. It's their bread and butter. It is what will be their success. Michael, looking at the NFL as a whole now, we know now that Tua Tagovailoa is on the IR. We'll see when he will be back, and it is a complete mystery. But in that Tua situation, with the concussions that he has sustained over the last 24 months, what are those conversations like for our front office, both in the short term, of course, to still win games, but also in the long term to address what to do with Tua Tagovailoa?
Well, you better get another quarterback. I mean, because nobody can predict the next concussion. I don't have a crystal ball. And I just know that if you're Chris Greer, you know that one more, and we said one more last year. He didn't get one more last year. He got through all 17 games without one. But this year, after 2 games, he has to. And Miami's another team that put no resources in their offensive line. They're counting on Terran Armstead, who's always hurt, to be their starting left tackle. That's not a good problem to have. So I think, to me, if you're in Miami, you have to say to yourself, look, if Tua plays 10 more years, great. But there's a chance he might not. One of the jobs of a general manager is to always think about what's the worst that could happen. What's the worst that could happen? And I know that's a negative world to live in, but that's part of the job. And I think, to me, that's what he has to do. And I think they've got to find themselves a young quarterback. Maybe they think of Skylar Thompson. I perhaps don't, but I haven't seen enough of him. They have to think of him that way and see if he can play that way. They're going to need somebody at some point. If Skylar Thompson's not good enough, they're going to need to draft one.
Yeah, for sure, for certain. And we've seen even Skylar Thompson go out there and the offense just get derailed. But at that point of the game, it was also a blowout against the Bills. When you look at the Tua situation too, Michael, we see all the responses come out of he's likely assessing how much he could get out of his bonus, what guaranteed money he can walk away with. Do you think that's what he and his team are doing, or do you think he's more assessing of, do I even want to play football anymore?
I can't, it's hard for me to figure out the mindset of a player. I mean, look, the way, I think instinctively, the way he took on the tackler, I mean, he absorbed the brunt of the hit. He gave the hit to, the
DeMar
player.
Hamlin.
I mean, DeMar Hamlin. So that was really, instinctively you had said slide, but, he's playing football. I don't know how to think for him. I can't answer that question. I do know that it's, longevity is important. And if you have children, you really want to make sure you can see them grow up and you want to be able to have a relationship with them. And I do think concussion protocol is important. So I'm happy they put him on injury reserve. So he has 4 weeks to think about it, whether he was cleared to play or not. I think sometimes look, Denzel Ward in Cleveland, he's had 5 concussions. He's still out there playing. He didn't miss any time. I think that becomes, if we have concussion protocol, we better be careful.
That's a great point you make. I even think back to the first Thursday Night Football, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, the way they were pushing the pile, the way Lamar was running, it was competitive football. You love to see that. It was the same thing with Tua in that situation, especially on 4th down. Talking again about young quarterbacks, Bryce Young benched after just 2 games with the Panthers. I mean, what David Tepper's done with Carolina has been terrible, but is Bryce Young salvageable at all, whether it's in Carolina or just down the road with another NFL team?
I think the question you should ask, are the Panthers salvageable? Like, who's making decisions in that building that knows what they're doing? I mean, look, let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
When you look at the Carolina Panthers, they converted 2 third downs all year. They've given up 50 points in the first quarter. The first half, they scored 3. They've been behind 50-3 at halftime. Take a guess how many third downs Patrick Mahomes has converted so far after 2 games.
I'll go 22.
He's converted 5.
5
okay. Third downs in 2 games. Okay, that's 2.5 per game. So he's not much better than Bryce Young, but yet, obviously he plays better than Bryce Young. So it takes some time. They spent all off season trying to get an offensive line together to make him a better player, and yet they've abandoned it after 2 games. And this is after they don't play him in the preseason. Look, if he was bad in the preseason and he was bad in practice, I get being impatient. We never saw him. They said, oh, everything's fine. I mean, Dave Canales came out and said everything's great. Everything's wonderful. After he throws 8 passes in the last preseason game, in a game that basically everybody on that field is going to get cut. Everybody on that field's getting cut. I mean, that's the game where you play all the guys that are going on practice or going to go on the waiver wire. So what did we learn from that game? I just think it's a lot of bad organizational decisions in Carolina, and it starts with the owner. I mean, look, they hired Dan Morgan to be the general manager. Dan Morgan was part of every decision that was made leading up to Bryce Young. He was Scott Federer. He was the assistant GM. How are you the assistant and then become the head guy and say, well, I didn't approve of anything that we did in the past? I mean, that seems somewhat strange to me.
Yeah, looking at since David Tepper bought the team, Michael, they're 31-70. He's gone through 4 head coaches. There's been 2 interims. And as you mentioned it too, they invested in the guards who have been terrific. But by the time they got Bryce Young everything he needed, he looks like he's lost his confidence. And that defense on top of it has just been terrible for the Panthers. And that's why it goes back to that situation conversation. And that's where it is. I agree with you. I don't know if Andy Dalton can do any better because that situation in Carolina is just so bad.
Yeah, no question. And I think to me, look, Andy Dalton will be a little bit better because he's got more experience, but that doesn't mean for the long term he's going to be better. And he's going to make the same mistakes that Bryce Young makes. I mean, look, it's a team that's not built conducively. They take a running back, they trade up in the second round to take a running back. They paid Miles Sanders all this money, and they have Chuba Hubbard on the roster. Mm-hmm. Like, don't you think they could have used another asset for another position other than running back? To me, that they're playing it's what I call playing Madden. They're just playing Madden. They're in their basement playing Madden, trying to collect skill. When the reality is their defensive front wasn't good enough, and they've gotten worse every single year that Tepper's been there.
Yeah, agree. And even you mentioned they bring a running back. That was a injured Jonathan Brooks that they drafted to bring in.
Yep,
doesn't make sense, especially at that spot. He's Michael Lombardi, host of the GM Shuffle. You can catch him on Coach with Bill Belichick and, of course, VSiN morning show as well every morning. Michael, I appreciate you taking the time. Always great talking football with you, sir.
Thank you, George. Appreciate you.